Welcome back. Now we've made some pretty good progress. We know how to move actors by adding a world offset to them. But the way we did this is somewhat problematic, and we're going to find out why in this lecture. Let's go back to our level blueprint. We see that we're calling add actor world offset, and we're doing this in event tick, which means we're doing this every frame. So we're taking this value, this vector, and we're using that as the delta location for add actor world offset. And we know that tick is executed very rapidly every single frame. Well, how often is that exactly? Well, that depends on the frame rate. And the frame rate is not constant. It actually changes from frame to frame. And it can actually be different from computer to computer. We can see what that frame rate is by going back to our viewport, and we can go up to the hamburger icon at the top left, and there's a checkbox to show FPS. We can actually see the frames per second. If we go ahead and enable that, we now have our FPS at the top right of our viewport. And as you can see, even while I'm not running a Pi session, that value is rapidly changing. Now the value beneath it is delta seconds, the time between frames, and that's shifting as well as our FPS is changing. So we're adding an offset every frame to our actors, and as we can see, that is just about every 8 or 9 milliseconds. So we're adding the same offset over and over again, but we're adding that offset at intervals, and the time between those intervals changes as the frame rate changes. So on my machine, I'm getting 114 or so frames per second, and when I press play, I get this type of movement that we see here. But if your frame rate is lower, then that means you're adding that same offset less frequently. Now, we can change our frame rate. We can cap it off at a certain value. We do this by going up to Edit and opening our project settings and searching for frame rate. And we have some options here. Now, we can choose to use a fixed frame rate by checking the checkbox, Use Fixed Frame Rate, and we can enter a value in here. If I leave this at 30, then I'm going to cap off my frame rate at 30. As you can see, it's now 30 frames per second. And the time between frames is now a whopping 33 milliseconds. So I'm going to press play, and I'm going to notice that both of my drones are moving quite a bit slower because we're not adding that offset quite as much, not as frequently, right? If we go into project settings and we cap off our frame rate at, let's say, 15 frames per second, and we come back to the viewport, well, notice now that my FPS is red. That means very, very bad frame rate. As I move around, look at this, I'm getting lag because my frame rate is so bad. And if I press play, look at that, they're moving really slow. And this is not a very good frame rate, but this just goes to show that as the frame rate changes, the rate of movement is changing because we're not taking frame rate into account. When we're moving an object and we're not taking frame rate into account, this is known as frame rate dependency. The movement of our objects is dependent on the frame rate. And frame rates change from frame to frame in all games, depending on how many calculations are performed by the engine at any given point in time. This means that if there's some kind of spike in the number of calculations performed in a game, maybe 20 or 25 players just spawned in and things are getting loaded in and calculations are being performed, that frame rate may dip to a lower value temporarily. And when that happens, we need to compensate for that with our movement. We need our movement to be constant. When our frame rate goes low, we need to move those actors by a larger amount. We need to scale that movement by our frame rate somehow. Well, doing so is quite easy. All we have to do to eliminate that frame rate dependency is take that value that we're moving our actors by, our delta location, and we need to scale it by the amount of time that passes between frames. So that way, if delta seconds gets really big, which means our frame rate just went down and we have some lag, well, delta seconds is a larger value, and so our delta location will be a larger value. And we'll move that actor by a larger distance to compensate for that frame rate. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to multiply our delta location by delta seconds. Let's take delta seconds, drag off, get a multiply node. We can get multiply nodes for floats as well, but we want to scale by our vector that we're passing into delta location. Now, if I click and drag it on in here, well, it's not going to work because the multiply node is expecting a float value, but we've seen how we can convert pins. We can right-click the pin and we can choose to vector, and now we have this built-in conversion to a vector, so we can take that vector value and plug it in, and now we can use this for delta location instead, and now we're scaling by delta seconds. Now, we know that delta seconds is a very, very small value, right? Which means we're going to get a slower movement because this vector is much smaller, right? Let's check that out. Let's press play, and look at this. This drone over here is moving very, very slowly, right? So we're going to have to scale that movement. And in fact, because we're multiplying the unit vector by 2 and then scaling by delta seconds, this gives us exactly the size of the vector we need for this particular frame that corresponds to this delta seconds in order to get 2 units per second. If we want 10 units per second, we would multiply that unit vector by 10, and then we get 10 units per second. And if we want 100 units per second, then we'd scale that vector by 100. So there we go. And as you can see, it's choppy because our frame rate is really low. 15 frames per second is terrible for games. But we're still moving at the correct speed. Even though it's choppy, we have lag, we're still getting that same amount of movement, that 100 units per second. So if we go back to project settings and we take that fixed frame rate and bump it on up to 60, which is a pretty decent frame rate, and we go back and test, now we still get 100 units per second, but because our frame rate is better, it's not choppy. It looks nice and smooth. And we're always going to move this drone by 100 units per second because our movement is scaled by delta time. It's independent of the frame rate. As the frame rate changes, our movement remains consistent. We can go back to project settings and set that fixed frame rate up to 120. And if my machine can handle 120, the engine will try to do that. Now, we're not quite making it up to 120 on this machine, but we're close. But if I press play, we're still moving at the same speed. It's not moving twice as fast, even though our frame rate is twice as fast. And that's because we're scaling by delta time. We have achieved frame rate independency. We're not dependent on the frame rate. And we can do this for our drone too as well. We can take that drone, take that delta location we're passing in, and we can scale it by delta seconds. We can drag delta seconds way over here. We can get a multiply node. We can convert that second pin into a 2 vector, and we can hook up this vector value into it and use that for delta location instead. Now, of course, I don't like these wires because it's looking kind of messy, but we've achieved the result we want. If we press play, we'll see that, well, it's barely moving at all because we're scaling the unit vector by 0.25 and then by delta seconds, and that's going to give us a super small value. Let's say I'd like this drone to move 200 units per second. I can put a 200 in there, and we see that it's moving twice as fast. And we have frame rate independency, which is perfect. All right, so now we know about the importance of frame rate independency. And no matter what our frame rate is, we will always move these drones by the same speed, even when our frame rate gets super, super low and our game is lagging out. Well, we're still compensating for the frame rate and achieving frame rate independency. Now, if you don't want these wires to reach across like that, you don't have to go and promote delta seconds to a variable and then use it over here. You can always access that delta seconds by right-clicking and searching for Get World Delta Seconds, and this gives us that delta seconds. We can use that instead of clicking and dragging delta seconds onto one of our nodes. So if you ever find yourself reaching across with wires like that, trying to get delta seconds into all your calculations, you can always just get world delta seconds, and that's the same value. So now that we have frame rate independency, Our drones are moving smoothly, we can control their speeds, and we now know the importance of taking delta seconds into account if we're going to add some kind of offset to an actor every single frame. Excellent job. I'm going to go ahead and hide that frame rate by disabling Show FPS, and I'll see you in the next video.